Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today, I speak with Larry Pollard, who some of you may know from the Staircase Netflix documentary and the HBO show as the guy who came up with the owl theory. Larry spends a great deal of time with us this evening and goes to some length and detail in explaining his theory and the evidence that it's supported with. In places, there are some sort of technical glitches. Larry was on a phone over in North Carolina, so quality drops out in places, but do stick with it because we try to sort this out as best we can. And yeah, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Cheers. Hi, Larry. Thanks for joining us today on Criminal Justice Natters. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, and I appreciate the invitation to be on your show.
No problem. Just in case there are some viewers that are not familiar with you, which I'm sure there would be not very many at all. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'll be glad to do that. I am 74 years old, and I have lived in Durham all of my life, with the exception of the years that I spent in law school. And I have worked at the North Carolina Attorney General's office for 3 or 4 years as a special prosecutor and was secretary of the Criminal Code Commission, which was charged with the responsibility of rewriting the Criminal Pretrial Procedure Act, and um, also took care of some of the post-trial motions and that kind of thing. I am a sportsman. I was taken and trained by my grandfather how to shoot a rifle, and I could shoot a little bitty Vicks vapor rug bottle out of the air with a 22 rifle every time he threw it up. And I got trained doing that, and I enjoyed my Saturday afternoons with him, going hunting in the woods and being out there in nature, so to speak. We
Yeah.
would take our dog, um, out there to go hunting for quail and anything else that moved at that time. And at that time, I was probably around 9 or 10 years old. Now, in addition to that, I was going to tell you I'm a sportsman by nature. I love it. I've spent a lot of time as a hunter and a fisherman, and I know a lot about wildlife. I was a Boy Scout,
Mm.
an Eagle Boy Scout, and a God and Country recipient of the God and Country Award when I was younger. I spent, the time I was 11 years old to the time I was 18 years old in the scouting world and did a lot of that camping out, seeing wildlife while I was out there in the camping world. After that, I went off to school at the University of North Carolina here in Chapel Hill. And after that, I went to law school at the Wake Forest University, where I have been invited back numerous times to give the program on the owl theory, and they seem to like it pretty much. I was
Yeah.
also, when I was in law school, I learned evidence pretty well. It was one of my better courses. And when I was hired after I graduated from law school, passed the bar, and started practicing law in Durham, um, I I became as part of the special prosecution team there at the Attorney General's office. I was the low man on the totem pole at that time, as we say, and they were kind enough to send a school for prosecuting attorneys at Northwestern University. And also, I went to another course in Detroit, learning about evidence and what things to look out for, things to watch, techniques to use, etc. And the
Mhm.
fact that I was assigned to the Special Prosecution Division, that knowledge held me in good that I was going around trying cases all over the state, and some that I'd already tried in Durham courts over here. After that, I I went to work for the North Carolina General Assembly. I had when I graduated from Carolina, I had asked, I went over to Raleigh one day and walked around and walked into the legislative building. The session was not in fact, but they did have the legislative services officer there, and he was willing to give me an interview about the legislature. So I looked on that, and then he advised me to go about seeing if I could work over there at the General Assembly.
Hmm.
And I was lucky to be recommended by the state senator from my home district, and he recommended me to the Speaker of the House, who had also been a graduate of Wake Forest University Law School, and he hired me. He hired me to be a supervisor of pages, pagettes, and press clerk. And as such, I got to know the gentleman very, very well. He encouraged me to go to Wake Forest University for law school, and I decided I would because I needed to put some distance between myself here in Durham to go to law school, simply because I had been taking care of my brother who had been injured in an airplane crash at Raleigh Durham Airport. In 2001, I worked exclusively on this owl theory case simply because I've lived there next door to that
Yeah.
house for 74 years now. At the time this happened, I had lived there for 51 or 52 years, and I was
Yeah.
very familiar with the animals that we have in the neighborhood, the birds and the owls that are there. Without a doubt, they are in the what was or became to be known as the Peterson House.
Yeah.
Originally, that was the old Buchanan home, and I played in that house as a child. When I was very, very young, I knew the back steps. I knew the mechanical chair that went up the back steps. And being a lawyer and having been trained in evidence and whatever, I just didn't think that the case against Michael Peterson held any water. In fact,
Yeah.
I was very surprised that they didn't have a better case. And
Okay.
even more than that, I'm surprised that they were unwilling to look at the evidence that I compiled in my own initiative and brought down to the authorities, the district attorney, and to the defense counsel. And I did my very best to lay it out for them, show them the reasons why I thought that this was an attack by a wild bird, and elaborate on it. And nobody wanted to listen to it. They just think they thought it was ridiculous. And I thought
Yeah.
it was ridiculous. They thought that all this stuff they were coming up with, that he had beat her in the head with a 4 foot long hollow tube, and he's swinging at her in a small back step area there, causing all these lacerations on the back right corner of the head. I said, how can he do that? I would have
Yeah.
thought he'd been facing her and would have hit her in the front of the head. All of these things that they came up with were actually ridiculous in my mind as a special prosecutor. Now, they were successful, and the district attorney was, but I think that he had a great deal of outside help from the newspapers,
Hmm.
writers that were writing articles either in the Durham Morning Herald or the News and Observer, and it seemed to be a cause celeb to go after Michael Peterson. He was the serial killer from Germany and all this other stuff, and it was just ungodly the amount of prejudicial pretrial evidence writings that they were having. So I've lived
Yeah.
there for the past 21 years. I've gathered more and more evidence. Mr. Peterson asked me to be his attorney when I took my owl theory public because I had gone out to hear about two guys that were in a business down close to Apex, North Carolina, which was 30 miles south of us. And they had been hit by an owl
Yeah.
going when they were walking out that evening to go to their car. And it was the same time of year, but a couple of years later that this was happening. And you very clearly see it on the videotape. And they called me
Yeah.
about this and make me aware of it. And when I saw it, I took it to the attention of WREL TV. And then later on, you see an interview with me, and you can Google it now if you want to, with David Crabtree with a mounted owl, and describing why I thought that these wounds had been inflicted by a bird of prey. And I knew that if it was a bird of prey, that that didn't qualify as a homicide. That's an attack by a wild bird. And a
Yeah.
wild bird is not susceptible to being charged with murder. And if that's the case, Mr. Peterson is automatically an innocent man. I'll
Yeah.
elaborate on this a little bit later when I get into some things that I finally uncovered and brought forward. What's your next question?
Yeah. So you say, like, the prosecution's case, you didn't think it held any water, but how did you discover this idea? How did you come up with this theory? Because it's very much your theory. And
Well, I'll be glad to tell you how I came up with it. I came up with it because I'm familiar with my backyard, their side yard, that
mm,
house, and the fact I've been there for 50 some years when this happened. I was very knowledgeable of the area, and I looked at the autopsy report and the descriptions of the wounds, and the fact that the two things that they were counting on as the cause for her death was blunt force trauma, and that um, blood loss may have played a role. Well, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I stipulate to the fact that this is blunt force trauma, and anyone who's ever touched the feet of an owl, a wild creature, those are bony, hard, circular, or whatever you call rectangle digits on their toes. And as a result of that, and the feet are hard, and that would have
mm,
caused blunt force trauma. And the next thing is, I think she laid there for almost 2.5, maybe 3 hours before anybody saw her.
yeah.
That because of the fact that there was so much blood. And I agree with the fact that blood loss definitely played a role in this whole thing. And the blood loss came about from the 7 to 8 lacerations that are on the back right corner of her head. Now, I started doing research over at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, which is an excellent museum of wildlife and things of that nature, because I had a hunch. I said, look at these wounds. These wounds tell you everything you need to know about this case. And the medical examiner is the one who did the autopsy and did it within 4 to 6 hours from when Mrs. Peterson died. And I said, this is a wealth of information. And I started looking at it, and I counted off the digits on a a mounted owl that was there at that museum, and there was 4 digits on each foot. I said, that's 8 lacerations if it hits and grips. And I learned that the owl is a zygodactylous bird. That means that the outside digit of its feet does not have a knuckle right here on this particular area. And that allows the outside digit, this one over here on the side, I'm
Hmm.
trying to get this so
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
see it, goes sideways, not just straight back. It can go straight back, but if it wants to go sideways, and the reason for that is because that kind of closes up the oval shape that owls are using when they're going out trying to catch the 2, 3 of uh, in circle. The prey and kills the prey quickly, because all of those digits going to the prey, the owl is gripped that prey with about 500 pounds of pressure on
Mm,
those 4 digits. And those needle sharp talons go all the way into the body and quickly kill the prey and keep it from bouncing around and trying to jump away, and also keeps it away from being attacked by another bird, a bigger owl or a whatever. It comes over there and wants to take the prey away from it. That their feet are locked once they've made that grip, and they can't let
Hmm.
go. They cannot let go of what it is they have in their talons until they get
Okay.
back to the nest and push out their legs again, like I'm doing now, and that
Yeah.
opens up the digits. And that's when they take the prey, cut it up, feed it to the chicks, or eat it themselves. And all of these
Okay.
are very easy to see in that autopsy. The wound on the far left of the autopsy report clearly shows an avulsion. An avulsion is where it's a piece of flesh that comes out and goes all the way back. It's like taking a spoon and going through a bowl of mashed potatoes. That when you do that with the zygodactylus digit, it causes the mashed potatoes to curl up. And the same thing if you put an apple in your hand and you got a knife in where it curls up. And I'm saying, well, this obviously, and I look up to the very top of where this laceration starts, and it's a very sharp point. It's too sharp to be that hook on the side of the blowpoke that they talked about.
Yeah.
Blowpoke couldn't do this. Blowpoke can make those kind of lacerations. The measurements don't mean anything to them, and they didn't pay any attention to that. There were wounds on Mrs. Peterson's body that were uh, like had the same measurement. One on the left elbow, one on the left wrist, and their measurement in the autopsy report 0.25 inches in diameter. Now, a blowpoke is going to be a lot more than that. And these wounds were very easy to look at. They had three of them underneath her right eye, right in the socket over here, underneath her the eyebrow, and
Hmm.
one on the nose, another one going down the inside of her nose. All of these couldn't have been formed by a blowpoke with a hook that's that long and whatever. Just the measurements don't add up. So, and then when you look at the right hand side of the eye, over here on this side, there were
Yeah.
three more marks up here that had 0.25, or if it wasn't exactly 0.25, it was very, very close.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
this is starting to raise reasonable doubt in my mind as to the cause of the wounds and what happened to her. And you have to realize the only issue in this entire case is what made those lacerations that allowed her to bleed to death. Yeah, I could see that she would bleed to death because of all the blood that was going to be coming out of those wounds. And
Yeah.
when the authorities got there that night, according to the evidence I've seen that has been on 60, I'm not 60 minutes, 2020 on television, other things like that, the videotape of when the police officers got there that night, all of the authorities, be it the coroner, be it the sheriff's, be it the police department, everybody made a rush to judgment because they
Mm.
looked down at her laying there and they said, "Oh,
Yeah.
this looks like a murder." And they
Yeah.
immediately struck it in their mind this was a murder.
So
And
that's what
sometimes,
David.
like Jim Harden said in the case, sometimes things are not as they appear to be.
Yeah.
But they didn't want to go past that. They just thought this was a beating. It was a case of domestic violence. And that's the way they approached this case. And it was even in the articles in the newspapers, if it was on the radio or television, and it was on the television most every night. Why, we
Yeah.
don't know, but it was. And they were zeroing in on this. He beat her to death with a 5 foot long hollow tube, and then he went running out to hide the blowpoke. And
Yeah.
it was a long way from that entrance to that staircase in their house over to where the front door, or actually it's the back door, but they call it the front door, is for him to go running out and hiding this bloody blowpoke. That just didn't add
Yeah.
up. And
No.
number one, the blowpoke couldn't carry that amount of blood all the way out to the circular drive where I had implied that that's where she was hit. And I came to that conclusion because I used the age old method of tracking a deer or animal that I've hunted and shot. And I had to use the age old method. And that is, you don't go to the spot where he runs into the woods, you go to the spot where he was standing at the time that you shot him. And
Yeah.
then when you get over there to that spot, you look at the spot in the woods that he went running into. You have that line of reference and you're walking down it very slowly. And within about 4 or 5 yards, you will find one single drop of blood, because that hole, wherever it is, the wound is going to
Yeah.
drip off and drop a little drop of blood. And as it goes forward, you're going to find another drop of blood. And then you're going to find another drop of blood. And it was that night and that experience that I'd had on recovering a deer that I had harvested that night. I had to go over and do the same thing, just follow that blood trail. And it hit me. I said, wait a minute. She wasn't hit inside. And those droplets are her blood dropping off of her hands that are in the back of her head because her hair has been yanked out by the root ball. It hurts, by the
Hmm.
way, to have
Yeah, I
your
can
head,
imagine.
hair yanked out by the blood is pouring forth from all of these lacerations back there. My question to you and everyone is, where would you go if you were outside at night around oh midnight, somewhere in that range, and 2 o'clock in the morning, when she gets hit in the back right corner of the head and hair being yanked out, and she has no idea what is
Mm.
attacking her because the attack is from the rear. She
Yeah.
doesn't see it. Now, she may feel it, and she probably realizes that's what's going on, but she is taking off for the house to get help, and she's going back to find somebody that will help her, either Michael, but he was out by the swimming pool, and there was
Yeah.
in the swimming pool there was a fountain, and that was creating a lot of sound. So any yelling or screaming that she would have been doing from that, it would have bounced off the side of the house, and because there are two wings on either of the main section where the front door was that are angled back towards that circular drive. And this is a very big house, about 9 to 10, 12,000 square feet. I don't know exactly, but pretty
Yeah. Yeah.
close
A
to
big
that.
house. Yeah.
Very big house. And if you establish that she was hit outside of the residence and runs into the safety of her house and down the corridor, collapses into the bottom of the staircase, and then she bleeds to death. She faints. She was under the
Yeah.
influence of Valium,
Yeah.
Flexeril, and alcohol. That's a pretty powerful cocktail.
Hmm.
And people don't realize that, but that was a very thin staircase, very narrow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the mechanical chair in there, had been there for a long, long period of time. And well, like I said, back when I was a child. And I don't think you can get those wounds underneath the crown of her head or even on the back of her head on that chair. And if she had been hit at the top of the steps, there would have been so much blood there at that time, it would have been 10,000 spots of blood at the top of the steps, not at the bottom. So when
Yeah.
she comes in, she has got her hands on her head. She's going into shock, and she falls backwards. And
Yeah.
that establishes one layer of blood splatter because it's wet. No, that first layer of blood splatter is dry because it's going to be laying there or on the wall for a longer period of time than the second fall that she has. So therefore, she fell down twice in that steps, and the last one
Right.
she fell down. She never went up very far on the steps. I only think that she went up one or two steps, and then she went boom, boom down at the very last. After she had laid there bleeding for 2 hours or more, and the reason I say that is she's sitting when they get there. She's sitting in a pool of her own blood. You don't
Yeah.
get a pool of your own blood that quickly. But if you're tracking an animal and you track it and go through it, they can run for half a mile or more. And when they finally find the animal, it would always be laying there in a pool of its own blood. It
Yeah.
takes a while for it to come out of the wounds. So all of this was giving me my instinct that this looks like something that the authorities need to know about. And I immediately called up and told them about this and tried to get it down to District Attorney Jim Harden later on. They didn't. They weren't interested in it. They didn't talk to me about it, and
No.
nobody, even the defense counsel, when I took it to them at the end of the trial, after all of these um, months of trial, I think the trial started July the 1st, and ended like October the 10th. And they did all through this stuff about he's gay, he's this, he's that, this, that, and the other. He was the serial killer over in Germany. None of that stuff. The thing that really surprised me was that father of the two girls that he adopted, uh, he was he lost his life in a um, attack or whatever back in Central America or something, and he was buried in Texas. And all of a sudden, if he was buried in Texas, now they want to go back out to Texas and exhume his body. To no, his wife was back there in Texas with him, and they wanted to exhume her body and put it in a hearse and drive it all the way back over to North Carolina and put it in front of the same medical examiner who had looked at Kathleen's wounds on the back of her head. And these wounds on the woman's head did not look at all like Mrs. Peterson's wound. And I mean, I was astounded by all of this, but nevertheless, the judge let it in. I thought that was cause for error right there.
Yeah.
Moving on, let me go ahead and just tell you that all of those things added up to my getting on the hunt, so to speak, of trying to find out what killed Mrs. Peterson. And I can tell you that the owl did not kill Mrs. Peterson, it attacked her. And from the laceration she received on the back right corner of her head, she bled to death. Now, had she gotten help? Yeah, she'd have been fine. But when she fell in that staircase and laid there bleeding, she asphyxiated. I agree with that. And that's what the medical examiner said. But when I was bringing forth other things to the medical examiner, they didn't think he had held any water, and neither did the district attorney or staff of his or anyone else. They all kind of ridiculed. And I said, you know, and it only recently have I gotten to the point that this is really something. It just hit me in the past couple of weeks, and this is important for your natter that we're having. One that did the autopsy on Mrs. Peterson at about 7 to 8 o'clock that morning. When they found her that morning around 2 o'clock, the coroner was there, and then they put her in a body bag and took her over to the morgue for her autopsy. And in the process of the autopsy, the medical examiner, first thing she does is opens the left hand and finds 38 hairs, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was 38 in her left hand. The medical examiner recovers those hairs and puts it in a white envelope, seals it, and sends it off to be analyzed because they were looking to see if the hairs were Michael Peterson's hairs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then they
Yep.
would have some proof. Okay. And then she opened the right hand of the deceased, and I think she had 25 hairs in that hand. And they all had been yanked out by the root ball. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, that's pretty interesting that they've been yanked out by the root ball. And I'm getting to thinking, this case is really very elementary because anybody that's in school in the fifth grade and goes out to play on the playground knows that if you get your hair pulled, it hurts. And
Yeah.
your automatic reaction is to reach up and grab it. And that's why, and especially since it had been yanked out by the root ball, that's what's going on. Oh, there's a lot of pain this woman was in. That was hurting. And that's why I'm saying that she was hit outside, turned around, and ran for the safety of her house down that corridor. I mean, down that brick steps, or also through the hedgerow there, back over to the front door, dripping blood of her going inside. And when she
Yep.
finally gets to that staircase that goes up to the second floor, she faints. And when she does, she lays there and she bleeds. And she's laying against the bottom stairwell wall there. And you see the blood on the walls at an angle. And the what's wiping stuff that you see, and they testify that that's Michael trying to clean up the blood. All that was doing just was pushing the dirt around. Regain consciousness because she'd been laying there for a while to have all that blood laid around her, and she attempts to stand up to go get help. And when she does, she steps with her bare feet into that pool of blood that's on the wooden steps. And blood
Yeah.
on wood is very slippery. They call that the
Yeah.
viscosity. All right. Now, at this point in time, she's weak. She's under the influence of all those other cocktails and chemicals and whatever. And
Hmm.
what happens then is she takes a step forward. Bottom of that staircase is cut like in a triangle. And it's not a great big square, or one step on the bottom is a rectangle, not a triangle. Well, at that moment, she's trying to regain consciousness and get help.
Yeah.
And she steps up, but in order to get out of that position that she's in, leaning up against that back wall, she's using her elbows to reach back to give her some leverage to push forward so that she can stand up. And when she stands up, she doesn't realize how weak she is and how unbalanced she is at that moment in time, and she falls back again. And this time, she hits the molding that is around the door on the inside of that staircase, and she slides all the way down until she hits the block of the molding that's in at the very bottom and is connected with that last step. And that's the one that, if you look at the wound, there's a wound on the underneath the crown of her head, underneath
Yeah.
here, where a blowpoke can't get to, and it's in the shape of a yoke, like that, so to speak. But if you turn it around and push it around on that block of molding at the bottom, you see it matches up pretty good. And the next thing is she lays there. Michael moves her, I think, when he gets in there, according to what I've heard, and he's moved her down further. But when the police get there, and the coroner gets there, and the police photographer is there, he's taking a movie, and he's recording every bit of that area and that scene. And you look at the bottom of her feet, she's got blood on the soles of her feet. The only
Yeah.
way to get blood on the soles of your feet is to step in it. That's why we're saying she stepped in it the second. That was the second fall. And that's the last wound she got on her head, underneath the crown. And she laid there bleeding and ultimately bled to death. Now, that is what I think happened. That is what I call the owl theory. Now, the people that are there at the house that night, they're filming everything. They're seeing her leaning up against um, those steps, And the only person there in the house is Michael, and he's got blood on him from when he moves her, and she's
Hmm.
covered in blood. And they assume and they make a rush to judgment that this looks like a murder. They even said that and said, this looks like a murder. And everybody went off in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the detail there. My next question, kind of what you've just said, but you broke up a tiny bit. It was about the reaction. You said you were subjected to ridicule. Do you
Yeah.
find, like, with time sort of passing, that more people subscribe and believe, or at least think it's plausible?
Oh, yeah. I think that when I demonstrate the owl theory with the props that I have and the description of that particular staircase and other things like that, I'm knowledgeable about that
Yeah,
staircase. I told you I played in it as a child.
yeah,
And I
yeah, yeah,
played in the yard. I know that the right between my house and the Peterson house, there is an old barn out there that was left from the original farm when it was a farm area out there, and it's where they put implements. I think the previous owners left their lawnmowers in there. I think that's where the uh, white Christmas deer were stored during the
hmm,
off season or whatever. I don't know that for a fact, but I've been told that's what it was done. And but went out there that day or that night and was going to move the white Christmas deer over to the house and then put it out in their circular drive because
yeah.
the children were coming in the next day, and it was a Christmas decoration. Now that in itself is a clue because owls, if you've done your research, you realize that owls go for the movement of the color white. And when an owl is sitting up in a tree and looking down, the ground looks black to them. But if they see something moving that's furry or something that looks like it's white, they think that's a meal. It could be a skunk, it could be a rat, it could be a squirrel, a rabbit. And remember, we were in a drought period of time at that era and that month, and that's the reason we couldn't go out in our backyard was because there was a burning ban. You couldn't go outside and light a fire, and
Mm.
the temperature was very balmy that night, warm, a moist air like you would find in Florida, and it could have been that she went out there and took those things over there, and then we're going to take them out to the circular drive because you have to put them together. They're not just already put together. You got to
No,
assemble them. And if she's putting them there and the owls are out there looking there and they see the movement, they could very easily say that where 90% of owl strikes hit people. That's in the treatises about an owl. I'm trying to get all this stuff to the district attorney. I'm trying to get it to uh, the defense counsel as quickly as I can, and nobody's paying much attention to it. And they're calling, or they're doing cartoons about me in the newspaper. That's okay. It goes with the territory. I thought they were rather funny myself. But nevertheless, it was kind of insulting because here I am, a lawyer, and have been a lawyer, a licensed lawyer for almost 35, 40 years. And I'm sitting there looking at this evidence. I had been to evidence school and I was using my knowledge and I'm trying to help my neighbor. That's the only reason I got involved in this case, is because of the fact that I was his next door neighbor. And I felt like the evidence didn't add up, and I took it to the authorities after inquiring with ethics committee's uh, the ethics committee chairman of the North Carolina State Bar as to what I should do with this evidence. And we were getting close to the end of the trial when this was happening. And she
yeah,
said, you would take it to the defense counsel and to the district attorneys right now. And I said, okay. I said, well, they're getting ready to make their arguments to the jury. And I don't think I ought to go running in there while they're making their arguments to the jury, yelling, the bird did it, the bird did it.
yeah,
Whatever little bit of credibility I had then would have been flown out the window, you might say.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
at any rate, I recognized I had to do what I thought was ethically correct, and that was I'd gotten my advice to take it to those entities, and the authorities were giving me that authority to go do it. And that's what I did. But they didn't want to look at it. I'd already left and had gone on a trip, and the district attorney went up and everything for them to look at. But after he made his oral argument to the jury, he didn't come back over to his office. I never did get a chance to see him. But nevertheless, I did get a chance to take it the next morning to the sheriff and ask him to look at it. And I had called him up at 6 o'clock in the morning, waking him up. And he said, "What's going on, Larry?" And I said, "Well, you always taught us when you were our football coach many years ago that when the going gets tough, the tough get going." He said, yeah, I know that. What are you here for at 6 o'clock in the morning and waking me up?" I said, "Well, here goes." I said, "Coach, I think Mrs. Peterson was hit by an owl outside of her residence, ran back into her house, ran down to the steps, and eventually collapsed into the steps, went into shock, and bled to death." And he looked at me and he said, "Larry, now this is my old football coach looking at me, and I got a lot of respect for this man. He was then the sheriff, and I love him dearly. He's one of my best mentors in my entire life. He would always come to football practice on that Harley Davidson motorcycle, and all of us loved it. Yeah, we loved seeing him coming in. At any rate, he said, he was looking at me kind of squinting. He said, "Yeah, Larry, you hadn't been drinking, have you?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, you're not on drugs or anything, are you?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "You sure?" I said, "I'll let you be the judge of that after you hear what I've got to say." And I said, "This is what I came down here because I was directed to come here to the authorities by the ethics chairman of the North Carolina State Bar. And I want you to help me get this information to the district attorney. I haven't been able to speak to him, and the other defense counsel is out of the country." And he said, okay, he would do that. I never heard another word until there was
Really?
a political event, and one of the guys that was running for governor over at a motel, we'd all been invited to go, all of us lawyers. We always get invited to those things. At any rate, he was there, and so was the district attorney. And I had this letter that I had printed up asking him to look into this. And I said, "Hello, how you doing, Jim?" And he turned around and said, "Look," I said, "what letter that I sent you?" And he said, "Credibility." And I said, "Well, I want you to look at it. I want to come down and talk to you about it so that you understand it. And if we can't get together, I'm going to give it to the sheriff and see if he wants to put it in the newspaper," because I felt that strongly about what I had. And that's the way that came out. Ever since then, I've been on a rampage trying to come up with the evidence that would show this. It's one thing to have a theory, but it's another thing to be able to prove the theory. So I recognized I had to assemble my evidence, put it into a plausible scenario of what had happened to the woman. And hey, I wrote articles for the Durham Morning Herald, and I even had to scold the News and Observer because one of their writers kept saying I was implying that the bird had actually hit her inside, and then the bird's theory was ridiculous. And I said, "Nah, that's all wrong." And I had to go through him and the other writers that were kind of trashing my owl theory. It seemed like everybody in the area was out to get Michael Peterson, even the News and Observer. When
Yeah.
the guy was found guilty, they mounted a 3-foot section of the newspaper in their lobby of their newspaper when you first walk in the door. I mean, it was like they were proud of that as they were if they had got or if I'd have gotten a 12-point buck deer, I'd have said, wow, and I'd have mounted it. Well, they had their headlines. And I said, something's not right here. So I kept working on it, and that's that. That's enough about the owl theory. But I've had numerous people to invite me to come up and talk to them at law schools, Wake Forest, other schools that I've been to, also city clubs that I've been invited to, and I usually take my little props and go through my dog and pony show. And when the people hear it and they see it, especially when they touch the talons on the mounted owl that I was able to borrow from the state wildlife commission, and they touch those talons, and they're just sharp as needles. And when you put that together with their gripping power and the fact that that this happened at night, you zero in pretty quickly on an owl. And people started to, but I think they felt like because I happened to be his next door neighbor that I was cooking up something. Not so at all. I've done all this because I was his next door neighbor, and I felt like that this was not right, and that I should do what my sworn obligation, duty, and responsibility was to bring this to the authorities and to have them look at it. And as I was telling you before, and this is really a summation right now, because I finally realized when you called me the other night and wanted to do this particular natter, I went back and looked over my evidence. And I started out with the autopsy report. And I looked at it, and it occurred to me that the medical examiner had opened the woman's hands, both right and left, and recovered all these hairs.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, now, I wonder if there's any kind of feathers on those hairs. And we wrote and asked if there were any feathers to the district attorney's office. And they said, no feathers were found. Within 6 weeks of Mrs. Peterson's demise, under the seal of the SBI is a trace evidence report indicating on slide 38 something or other, first and the fourth page, I believe. Don't hold me to my numbers of pages or this, that, the other. I got all kinds of numbers rolling around in my head, but at any rate, that those feathers were 38 So obviously,
Oh no, I've lost you.
there we go. Okay.
Okay, so
okay. I got that in my hand
if
there, so I need to take it. But this is really
if
important.
we
And
so the trace evidence report.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you something. The reason I'm coming on this is because this is real important, and that is
perfect.
that I realized that the authorities had all of the material that it took me years to gather, and they had it that very first morning, and they had it, and they looked at it. They denied that there were any feathers found. Well, in the report, it says there, and I've taken them at their word. They're their official, authoritative nature people, and the SBI is in charge of examining these hairs and looking to see if there's trace evidence there. Remember, I used to be a special prosecutor. I knew where to go to find some of this stuff, and bingo, there was 500 or 600 hairs that were recovered that night, from the medical examiner from the body. 600 hairs or more, and they only mounted 81 on slides. I thought, wow, well, we struck gold. I could have won the lottery if that happened. And then to find out that on one of those hairs, and by the way, All of the hairs were determined to be Mrs. Peterson's hairs, not Mr. Peterson's, like someone suggested in one of the news media prints. But I'm sitting there looking at it, and I'm thinking, we've been writing letters to see if there were any feathers found. In fact, they were putting it in the newspaper. Well, where are the feathers? Where are the feathers? Well, at that point in time, I said, well, guess what, folks? We're going to call a press conference. And we held it outside the courthouse. And the different people came to see it. And I had the owl there and everything. We requested any feathers. And they said there weren't any. Well, folks, we have found the feathers. And then guess where they are? They're upstairs on the 6th floor of the courthouse here in the evidence locker. At least I thought they were there. But by then we'd had a new district attorney appointed, and I went by to see him and showed him the reference to that feather. Now it's typed up, but I still wanted to look at it because I knew some things that I don't think that everybody else had done their homework on, and I wanted to see it. Well, the district attorney at that time said, yes, you can see it. So we brought that slide over to look at. I hired some people that were experts with microscopes to put that slide underneath the microscope. And at first we just looked at the slide, and you couldn't see the feather just by looking at the slide. And that's why we ordered a microscope to be brought in. And because I was looking for something and I knew what it was. And that was, I had seen what I thought was a feather in there on her hair. And they said, really? I said, yeah. The people that were with me said they didn't see anything. But when we put it underneath the microscope and we pulled it up 400 power, you very clearly see microscopic feathers. And not only that, they are wrapped around the hair shaft of Mrs. Peterson's, identified by the medical examiner. Now, the hair shafts were key to me. And I said, well, what's all those little spots on those hairs? And I said, well, take it on up, get it closer. And we took it up as far as it would go. And we quickly found that it was not just one feather that they had referenced, but 2 feathers, and that there were little black dots in between the feathers. And they were holding the feathers onto Mrs. Peterson's hair shaft. Because when we turned that thing up to 800 power, the little black dots that looked like pepper turned into fresh droplets of red blood. It was dry blood at that time. But at any rate, that came about within 6 weeks of Mrs. Peterson's demise.
Okay.
That report was started, I believe, on February the 12th, 2002. Remember, the trial was over in October of 2001. She died in, what day was it? December the 9th, 2001. And 6 weeks later, there's this little report saying feather. And I'm sitting there going, hot dog. I call that my smoking feather. Now, everybody gets a chuckle out of that, but I'm very serious about that. And the reason I am is because it connects the victim with the hair shaft, the attacker with the feathers, and the fresh droplets of blood indicate that an attack has happened and there's blood there. And I call that my smoking feather. And I've been talking about it. I made a joke out of it at first, but the more I've gotten to think about it, that is the most important piece of evidence in this entire case of 29 years. That is the most important piece of evidence. And they had it within 6 weeks of her death. Now, you can say what you want to about it, but that was well within time for them to have looked at it. And I think very, very ironical that Mrs. Peterson literally is handing us the piece that is the most important piece of evidence in this whole 29-year case. It was recovered by the medical examiner that morning, and she opens her fingers and pulls out those hairs, puts it in an envelope. Now, granted, the medical examiner, she didn't know what was on that feather. She didn't know what was on that stuff at the time. But later on, they sure did, because they had the report within 6 weeks. And the last portion of that was maybe in October, when all of these little things had been looked at. And that's why I say it is so ironical that this little bitty microscopic feather, and that is also another important point, it is microscopic. We took this to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and we got the lady who was the head of the section that looks at microscopic feathers that may have come from birds that fly into a jet engine and cause the engine to quit and whatever. She's the one that looks at them and determines the type of bird. Well, she told me when we took it up there, she said, Larry, we can't tell you that it's an owl on the basis of the chemicals that are normally in the spindles and the kind of things that looks like a fly rod where the sections come together. There's a pigment in there that they can use that determines the exact type of bird. But she looked at me and she said, but I can tell you that this is a microscopic feather fragment. And she looked at me and said, and I said, oh boy, is that any good? She said, go back and look at, do your research. I came to find out that owls are one of the few species, if not the only species. Now, all of the owls, you got a lot of owls all over the world, but I think their species is the only one that has microscopic feathers that you can barely see. They're smaller than the hairs on the top of your hand, and they're microscopic. And therefore, that's what I said. I felt like I was close enough to it that we would depend upon the fact that it was a microscopic feather, and it was put up, and we had pictures of it holding the feathers onto the woman's hair shaft. That I was compelled to bring that forward, because if that is the case, that proves that an owl did this attack. Yeah. And if an owl did the attack, it doesn't qualify as a homicide. And if it doesn't qualify as a homicide, it can't be murder one or murder two or manslaughter or anything else. It's an attack by a wild creature. After that, I came to find out that a motion had been made during the trial, or at the end of the trial, that all of the evidence that was collected and presented at that trial was destroyed. If I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong. But again, and that's why I'm bringing it forth to the authorities. And I said before, it's ironical. This little piece of feather, and on these two feathers, is the most important piece of evidence in that case. Not the fact that he's gay or was not a gay, or not the fact that he's a liar, not the fact that, oh gosh, whatever this, that, and the other come up. With a 5-foot-long blowpoke that no one could ever find. And I said to myself, I think that the public needs to know about this. And that's what I've done. And I've done it because he was my next door neighbor. I felt like I'm a Christian. It says in the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. And I know people don't like to hear that kind of thing, but these are the values and the things that I was trained on. One, I was a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout, God and country. I was a sportsman all of my life. I've watched birds. I call birds. And I know what I'm looking at when I look at them. Now, some birds have different calls than other calls. And you have to identify them to actually know which bird you're talking about. And the only thing I can say with the lacerations that I see and the back right corner, the only thing I can zero in perfectly now is that it's an owl. And it's um, a great horn owl would have crushed your skull, would have caused too much damage. The barred owl, Barred, is the one that I have said I thought this would be the one that would have been the culprit that would have hit her, because that's the most prominent one we have in the neighborhood, and because it roosts in the pine trees right across the street from where this happened. And in the autopsy, and even in the film, you see them pull out a pine needle. A pine needle is
Yeah.
not just, a little bitty thing. It's sometimes 5, 6 inches long. Now,
Yeah.
if that's the case, that's transfer from where the bird is sitting on a limb and it's watching down there on that area where the trash cans were, and that's what they do. They look to see if there are any rats, squirrels, mice, whatever, going to be coming around there, and they're looking at it. That's the hunting ground. And when they see one move, they come off of that limb that they're on and swirl down and come in about 30 miles an hour. And when they hit, it's a hell of an impact. And it caused Mrs. Peterson to unfortunately die. And I'm very sorry about that. I'm not trying to make fun of her or her
No,
family.
no, I know.
And but I feel strongly that if this is the truth, that's what I'm looking for, and that's what it and justice. What's your next question? I told you I could
Well,
be a little bit wordy.
yeah, I mean, you've covered so many, and pretty much every question I've wanted to that I had written down for you. So I'm just going to end, just very briefly about the HBO show that recently aired. And I know some of the editors and producers have taken umbrage with it. David didn't like certain parts of it. Did you think it was a fair, factual representation of the whole thing?
Of the film or the case?
Yeah. Well,
Which one?
both. Choose the film
Okay,
first.
okay. Was the film a fair representation of the whole case? Um, I'm not a movie critic, and I'm just a lawyer. But nevertheless, I have been taught over the past couple of weeks of this HBO Max movie that at first I was kind of confused the way it jumped back and forth. And people said to me, "We don't even know who you are in that movie." And so I said, "Well, I don't know what's going on. It's kind of unusual." But when I was told by the documentary filmmakers that their movie was to document what it was like to be embedded in a defense or a murder trial and be able to be privy to all of the things that were being done and decisions that were being made in regard to this particular case. And that was documentary. Those things had to be very accurate and held up. Now, in the movie, some of those things, I don't know if they're documented well enough, but at the same time, I think they tried hard to achieve the image that they were trying to get, because this movie is not a documentary. It is a movie made for Hollywood and therefore for entertainment. And if they're doing a movie for entertainment and trying to attract customers to come to the movie theaters and look at it, and at the same time bring out the key points of this particular 29-year-old or 21-year-old case, then they did a pretty good job.
Yeah.
I was quite impressed, very impressed with Tony Collette's
Yeah.
depiction of being hit by the owl.
Yeah.
That was very, very good, in my opinion, and a very fair representation of it. And in my opinion, she deserves an Academy Award for doing that. And not just that one, but she had to die 3 times in that movie. And
Yeah.
poor thing, she each time she did it, she made it believable.
Yeah.
And I really congratulate her, and she at least deserves a nomination for best supporting actress, if not the best actress. I really was impressed with the work that they did on the owl theory segment.
Th-
Uh, for the other things pertaining to the relationships of the family members, even though I knew my next door neighbor and I knew his family, the 2 boys, and I knew the girls, whatever, I didn't know the individual relationships
yeah.
that well. I'm a lot older than they are, and I
Yeah.
don't run in their circles. But at the same time, I knew that Michael was proud of them, and Kathleen, she was very proud of Caitlin, and still is, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Caitlin's going to be an attorney, from what I understand, and I think she'll make a very good one. And I hope that she will take the time to look and use her head, comparing evidence and things like that about the owl theory, because I don't want to see her go through the rest of her life thinking that her stepfather or whatever killed her mother.
Yeah.
And again, she may very well believe that. If she does, she's entitled to believe that. But
Yeah.
I've done this with the intentions of finding the truth and finding the justice. The
Yeah.
justice is he's an innocent man. The truth is what the facts show. And the theory, as far as the movie is concerned, I think they did a real good job in certain things. It is not a spellbinder, but it's one that they keep people coming back to look at it
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
actually figure out what happened. And I've
Yeah.
got my point of view. Other people, the state says no, he beat her with a 5 foot long blowpoke and went running out to hide it. And this kind of thing to proven motive. As for the what are the other things that they had coming on? I don't know. I just wasn't privy to everything that was going
No.
on next door.
No. Larry, I really want to thank you for your time this evening, this afternoon for you. It's been such an interesting chat, and thank you very much for giving up over an hour to come and talk to me. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
I'm very much appreciative of the invitation to come and do this. In fact, I have been reading your bio, and I'm quite impressed with you and the records you have established. So, if you want somebody to come and talk to your class and talk about evidence,
Absolutely.
I'm your
Yeah.
man.
Let's
Okay.
uh let
All right.
let's sort
It's
that
been a
out.
pleasure doing this
Absolutely.
natter. Okay.
Thanks, Larry. You
You
take
have a
care.
good
Cheers.
afternoon. Cheers
And
to
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today, I speak with Larry Pollard, who some of you may know from the Staircase Netflix documentary and the HBO show as the guy who came up with the owl theory. Larry spends a great deal of time with us this evening and goes to some length and detail in explaining his theory and the evidence that it's supported with. In places, there are some sort of technical glitches. Larry was on a phone over in North Carolina, so quality drops out in places, but do stick with it because we try to sort this out as best we can. And yeah, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Cheers.